بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين نحمده ونسبحه ونقدسه على آلائه ونعمائه ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له إلها واحدا أحدا فردا صمدا حيا قيوما نؤمن له بالربوبية ونقر له بالعبودية من يهد الله فهو المهتدي ومن يضلل فلن تجد له وليا مرشدا ونشهد أن سيدنا محمدا عبده ورسوله أرسله بالهدى ودين الحق ليظهره على الدين كله ولو كره المشركون اللهم صل وسلم وزد وبارك وترحم على محمد وآل محمد كما صليت وسلمت وباركت وترحمت على إبراهيم وآل إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد وصل اللهم وسلم على جميع الأنبياء والمرسلين والشهداء والصالحين وعترة نبيك الطاهرين عباد الله أوصيكم ونفسي بتقوى الله عز وجل. قال تعالى في كتابه الحكيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والله أخرجكم من بطون أمهاتكم لا تعلمون شيئا وجعل لكم السمع والأبصار والأفئدة لعلكم تشكرون. صدق الله العلي العظيم. Brothers and sisters, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. For those of you who tuned in last night, we spoke about the Islamic perspectives on intelligence. And today we want to talk about the acquisition of knowledge. And we mentioned that in the same way that intelligence comes in different forms, there are multiple intelligences. Likewise, when it comes to knowledge, there are multiple dimensions. So the Quran, for instance, when it describes the knowledge and insight of the Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, Joseph, in chapter number 12, he says to him, وَكَذَلِكَ يَجْتَبِيكَ رَبُّكَ وَيُعَلِّمُكَ مِن تَأْوِيلِ الْأَحَادِيثِ. Verily, God has chosen you and He has given you the ability to interpret dreams. That's a higher level of knowledge that nobody else at that time was bestowed with. In describing the Prophet Abraham, peace be upon him, in chapter number 6, verse 75, God says, وَكَذَلِكَ نُرِي إِبْرَاهِيمَ مَلَكُوتَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. That verily we gave Abraham insight into the inner dimensions of the world, the inner working. So not just what's at the surface, but what goes beyond that, what is beneath the surface. Think about it like this. If you go to a doctor, the doctor is going to examine you, he's going to look at you and analyze you differently than a tailor. A tailor looks on the outside, on the surface, acquires measurements in order to make those clothes. But a doctor will look on the inside. So they'll use a different tool. They'll use maybe a stethoscope or an EKG or an EMG or the various devices that allow them to figure out what's going on beneath the surface, what's going on the inside. So in the same way that we have multiple variations or multiple intelligences, when it comes to knowledge, there are multiple dimensions. There's an inner dimension and an outer dimension. There is what is beneath the surface versus what is above the surface. One narration which is attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he says the following. He says, رَبِّ أَرِنِي الْأَشْيَاءَ كَمَا هِيَ. O Lord, this is a prayer from him, a supplication. Show me things as they are in reality. Sometimes we'll look at something, and we mentioned last week that our brain may interpret that thing differently than what it really is. One person will see a dog and they'll be threatened by it. They will feel fearful, whereas someone else may run towards the dog and they'll want to pet it and hug that dog. So it's the same object, the same thing that's being looked at, but there are different interpretations. So having that inner knowledge, being able to see things beneath the surface rather than just at the surface. So how do we as Muslims, what is the Islamic take on the acquisition of knowledge? So first of all, when we look at the history of the acquisition of knowledge, one of the earliest ideas that is discussed is the idea of dialectics, and this was popular during the time of the ancient Greeks. It started with Socrates, and the whole idea behind dialectics is learning and acquiring knowledge through discussion and debate. When you study modern discussion and debate, you first learn about, and when you study the history of it, you learn about the history of dialectics. It appeared during the time of Socrates, and then it went on to Plato and Aristotle, and they formed their different theories around the acquisition of knowledge. When it comes to the acquisition of knowledge, and obviously there are many theories about that. In last night's lecture, I mentioned Jean Piaget, who was a Swiss psychologist, one of the early scholars who spoke about cognitive development. There was another theorist in the 20th century by the name of Edward Thorndike, and he wrote a treatise called The Fundamentals of Learning. And in that, he spoke about how we learn. How is it that people learn? And so he spoke about 6 laws of learning that I want to share with you. Number 1 is what he referred to as the law of readiness. What does that mean? That means that a person can learn when physically and mentally he or she is ready to respond to instruction. What does that mean? That means that you can come in with a whole lot of knowledge, but if a person is not ready to learn, if a person is not ready to receive instruction, it doesn't matter how good or how high quality the knowledge is. They're just not ready to receive. I remember I had a Spanish teacher in high school, and he picked up pretty quickly on kind of the shenanigans in the class and how so many students were not really interested in the topic. And so as soon as we would walk into the classroom, in order to have a sense of control, the first question he would ask us is, "Are you ready to learn?" And we had to respond in the affirmative. Yes, I'm ready to learn. And until we responded, no learning took place. So the law of readiness, and they'll tell you that, when the student is ready, you've heard, when the student is ready, the teacher shall appear. If the teacher appears and the student isn't ready, the student won't recognize anything from the teacher. So sometimes, even though visually we can see, and the Quran speaks to this effect, that visually we can see, we can hear from our ears, however, we're deaf and we are blind. Summun bukmun umyun fahum la yarji'un. One of the first verses in chapter number 2 is deaf, dumb, and blind, and they cannot return. They cannot return to the true path. That's not speaking about literal blindness or literal deafness, but some people, they're simply not ready to receive guidance. So the law of readiness is that a person can learn when physically and mentally he or she is ready to respond to instruction. This is the first law. The second law is the law of exercise, which says that learning is an active process that exercises both the mind and the body. Through this process, the learner develops an adequate response to instruction and is able to master the learning through repetition. Which is why when you find people who their learning is confined to just listening, there's no activity, there's nothing moving, there's nothing really going on. So it exercises both the mind and the body. And that's why they say that if a person is actually doing something, then they learn, because it's not just the mind that's engaged, it's the body that's engaged. So that's called the law of exercise. And so you master learning something through repetition. There's a theory that says that if you spend, it's called the 10,000 hour rule, some of you are familiar with. It says that if you spend 10,000 hours doing something, you become a master of that thing. Imagine how much time it takes to practice a skill, whatever that skill is, for 10,000 hours. And research suggests that when you get to that roughly 10,000 hour mark, that the brain starts to figure out new, innovative, and creative ways to carry out that same task that in the beginning required all of your mind, all of your attention, all of your heart. So the law of exercise, that's number 2. Number 3 is called the law of effect. Learning is most effective when it is accompanied by or results in a feeling of satisfaction, pleasantness, or reward. Think about the times that you learned something and you took a lot of pleasure out of it, satisfaction. That's when it became most effective. You might have had a teacher who made learning very fun when you were young. You might have had someone teach you something and it was very rewarding. So that's the law of effect. Number 4 is called the law of association, which says that in the learning process, the learner compares the new knowledge with his or her existing knowledge base. Think about that. How many times have you learned something and it challenges the assumptions that you already have? If you're not learning anything that's challenging what you already know, then you're not really learning. So that's the law of association. Number 5 is called the law of recency. Practice makes perfect, and the more recent the practice, the more effective the performance of the new skill or behavior. If you've ever learned something, whether it's a skill or whether it's a language, for instance, this happens when we learn languages, is because we don't practice them, we forget those languages. And the more recent the practice, the more effective. Sometimes when you have to speak that new language, or if it's a skill that you acquired in sales or cold calling or whatever it is, when you start in the beginning after not doing it for a long time, when you resume, you have to get some of that rust off. So that's called the law of recency. And number 6 is called the law of intensity, which basically means that real life experiences are more likely to produce permanent behavioral changes, making this type of learning very effective. Think about when you learned something, you learned a lesson from a real life experience. Why is that the case that it becomes more effective? Because instead of just sitting in a classroom, not just your mind is engaged, your body is engaged, your emotions become engaged, your psychology becomes engaged, so you're more likely to learn from that. And that basically leads us to the next discussion. And some of you probably know this. This is called the learning pyramid. And this is taken from the National Institute of Applied Behavioral Science, which basically describes the percentage of information that we are able to retain through different methods of learning. And so they say that 5% from a lecture. So if you listen to a lecture, normally you retain only about 5% of it, which is why speakers get away with repeating lectures, unless it's a story. So when it's a story, the brain remembers stories, but most of what we say isn't really remembered, which works well for us. 10% of what we read is retained. 20% audio-visual, so if you see a PowerPoint presentation or something like that. 30% through demonstration. 50% through discussion. 75% through practice doing, and 90% when you teach others. So the most amount of information retained, the most amount of knowledge acquired and then retained happens when you teach others. That's why the more engaged we are with teaching, that's why there's such a high reward from the Islamic perspective when it comes to teaching. That's why the Prophet, peace be upon him, said that he who teaches me a word has rendered me his slave. because there is so much merit and benefit in being able to teach. And for those of you who have taught anything, whether it's in the classroom or outside of the classroom, the more you teach a concept, if you read something and then you go out and teach it the same day, you're more likely to retain that information. According to the National Institute of Applied Behavioral Science, it's about 90%. Now, why is that the case? Because if you actually look at the pyramid, if you look at the top of the pyramid, which is the 5% from a lecture and then 10% reading, 20% audio visual, at the top of the scale, it's only auditory learning. You're learning by hearing. From 10 to 30%, which is reading, audio, visual, and demonstration, is visual. So that's another aspect of, our anatomy, which lends itself to the retention of information. And then when it comes to discussion, right, we talked about dialectics, which began with Socrates, and then practicing something, which is repetition, and then being able to teach others, that adds a kinesthetic, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, aspect to it, which means that it's not just audio visual, you're not just hearing it and seeing it, your body is actually moving when you're discussing something, when you're teaching something. Your body is actually moving, and you're heavily involved, which explains why so much is retained. And so the quintessential example of that is the life of Imam Ali alayhi salam. Imam Ali, that master student who became the master teacher. What does he say about knowledge? He says the following. He says, "O seeker of knowledge, knowledge has many merits. If you imagine knowledge to be a human being," he says, "its head is humbleness. Its eye is freedom from envy." These are all attributes which are associated with knowledge. So just like we mentioned with intellect, that it's not just book smarts, it's not just being able to answer a question. It includes integrity, it includes character, it includes reasoning, it includes doing the right thing. Knowledge is the same way. Its eye, knowledge, is freedom from envy. Its ear is understanding. Its tongue is truthfulness. Its memory is research. So you want to build your memory through research. Its heart is good intention. Its intellect is the knowledge of things. Its hand is compassion. Its foot is visiting the learned. When you visit the learned, your knowledge increases. When you spend time with people of knowledge, it compounds and your knowledge increases. Its resolution is integrity. Its wisdom is piety. Its abode is salvation. Its helmsman is well-being. Its mount is faithfulness. Its weapon, check this out. Its weapon is softness of speech. If you remember, we spoke about the opposite of ilm. Some scholars saw that the opposite of ilm is jahl. And jahl is not ignorance, but rather being rabid and confrontational. Here he's saying the weapon of knowledge is softness of speech. So when you're knowledgeable, the weapon of that knowledge is softness of speech, not blunt, harsh speech. Its sword is satisfaction, when you're satisfied with Allah. Its bow is tolerance. Its army is discussion with the learned. That's the army of knowledge. Its wealth are refined manners. You look at a person's wealth, and you look at their bank account, their assets, their businesses, what they own, right, their properties. He says its wealth are refined manners. Its stock is abstinence from sins. Its provision for journey is future. Its drinking water is gentleness. Its guide is divine guidance, and its companion is the love of the elect. The elect are the awliya. The companion of that person is the love, that is knowledge, is the love of the awliya, those who are close to God, those who are beloved by God. So knowledge is multifaceted. It has multiple dimensions, just like we mentioned in the beginning. There is the inner aspect of knowledge. There is how we retain information, right? So when does it begin? When does the acquisition of knowledge begin? Now we can go back to that verse that we mentioned in the beginning, chapter number 16, verse 78. And there's a couple of other verses as well. Chapter 23, verse 78, and chapter 67, verse 23, which says the following, that Allah has brought you forth from the bellies of your mothers while you did not know anything. So in the wombs of our mothers, when we were created, when we were developing as a fetus, we had no knowledge. He made for you hearing, eyesight, and hearts so that you may give thanks. And in those three verses, when God speaks, when he describes the different, aspects that we have, the different abilities, hearing always comes before eyesight. He made for you hearing, eyesight, and hearts so that you may give thanks. Why does hearing come before eyesight? Well, what do scientists tell us? What do educators tell us? They tell us that the human auditory hearing system is mature enough at about 7 months after conception to hear the mother's voice and to begin to be aware of both pleasant sounds coming from the mother's voice and, on the other hand, angry and loud sounds from that same voice. And how are they able to measure that? There's a device called an EMG, which stands for electromyographic. So electromyographic measurements. It's basically a way to measure movements, and they use it to measure movements in the womb and whatnot. And the way that they were able to test that baby in the womb at 7 months, its comprehension of hearing sound, is by exposing it to certain sounds and voices. And based on its response, whether it was agitated or calm, they're able to figure out that the power of the mother's voice that it has on calming the baby, which explains that when a baby is with his or her biological mother, the calming effect that it has. And so what they figured out was that the baby hears before the baby sees. And the Quran tells us that you were in your mother's wombs and you knew nothing, then God gave you the ability to hear, and then He gave you the ability to see. And then He gave you hearts, meaning the ability to understand. And so this fact is referred to in the Quran, that learning is a process that begins even before birth. So fathers, mothers, prospective mothers, watch your words. Be careful of your environment. If you're in an environment of gossip and backbiting, the child begins to hear that before that child is even born. Becomes familiar with that type of speech, becomes familiar with that type of speaking, which explains a lot about some children, if you know what I mean. So the Quran describes sound coming first. And so when does it actually begin? When does that process of teaching, as parents, when do we have that responsibility from an Islamic perspective to begin to teach our children? As early as possible. Some are in the habit of reciting Quran to their children, to their babies before they're even born, which is a beautiful practice. They say if you know it's a male and you want him to be good looking, recite Surah Joseph, because he was a good looking man. And if you don't, recite Surah Al-Ankabut, the spider. He'll come out looking like a spider. So the acquisition of knowledge begins at a very young age. And not only that, it never really ends. As human beings, we're constantly developing, we're constantly learning. And the reason I say that is because society today tells us that there is a set time for learning. And so many people believe that as long as I'm in school, as long as I'm in university, I should be learning, I should be acquiring knowledge, I should be growing intellectually. But once I'm out of there, I don't have any responsibilities to continue to learn. Which is why most people get out of university and they never really read a book cover to cover unless it's, I don't know, Harry Potter or something like that. Whereas if you just continue the process of learning, and there are so many ways to learn, and I'll just talk about one suggestion. I was reading an article recently, and the article was written last year, and the title of the article was "Why I Don't Listen to Music While Driving." And the author of the article was talking about how every minute you have is gold. You can use that towards learning, especially while you're commuting. And he says the following. He says, if your daily commute, and this is just one example, if your daily commute is like the typical worker, now think about this pre-COVID, you'll be spending 1 to 2 hours driving every day. That sounds about right for living in Southern California. He says, if I remember correctly, most college classes were around 4 hours a week and only lasted 10 weeks. That means that you'll be able to finish a college class in around 20 working days. If you're in your car and instead of listening to music, or if you're listening to the news over and over again, if you listen to an audiobook, if you listen to something beneficial, you'll basically be able to finish a college class in around 20 working days. Now, I'm not saying give up college and start listening to audiobooks. This is to supplement. This is in addition. This is to those who want to continue to further their knowledge, their acquisition of knowledge, their retention of knowledge, their ability to spread and share knowledge with others. And of course, as we know, based on the ahadith, there is so much merit to knowledge. And I'll just end with this. It's a narration from the Prophet, peace be upon him. He was asked the following. He was asked, what is knowledge? He replied, to keep silent. He was asked then, he said, to listen attentively. He was asked then, he said, to remember. So first is to keep silent. Second is to listen attentively. The third is to remember. Then he was asked then, he said, to act upon. So knowledge, again, to know and not to do, it's as if you do not know. To act upon, meaning to act upon what is learned. He was asked then, he said, to propagate, meaning to share. So for those of us that acquire knowledge, it's our job to act upon what we know and then to share what we know. And there's a very special verse in the Quran that comes in the form of a dua, and we'll end with this. It says, وَقُلْ رَبِّ زِدْنِي عِلْمًا, and say, "O Allah, increase me in my knowledge." We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to increase us in our acquisition of knowledge. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ وَالسَّلَامُ عَلَيْكُمْ وَرَحْمَةُ اللَّهِ وَبَرَكَاتُهُ.